My Lords, the hybrid sitting of the House will now resume. I ask members to respect social distancing. Questions on a statement made in the House of Commons on Tuesday, the 12th of January, an update to the government's response to the forced labour in Xinjiang. I call the front bench speakers first. Lord Collins of Highbury.
My Lords, the serious human rights violations in the Xinjiang are of enormous concern across all sides of this House. I welcome the statement and the government's recognition on the need for the UK to act. However, it is disappointing that once again the government have been unable to bring forward proposals for sanctions against those responsible for those abuses. We have repeatedly asked in this House whether they will apply Magnitsky-style sanctions to officials involved in the persecution of the Uighur Muslims, only to be told they will not provide a running commentary on the designation of sanctions. My Lords, the evidence of slave labour, in addition to forced detention and other serious abuses, is overwhelming. So, in the absence of such a proposal, can the noble Lord at least confirm whether discussions with global allies are at least taking place to prepare for sanctions like those already authorised by the US? My Lords, turning to the measures in this statement, first, the government has announced guidance to the UK businesses on specific risks faced by companies with links to Xinjiang. Such guidance is welcome, but unless it is legally enforceable, then regrettably there may be some who do not feel the compulsion to comply. What representations has he made to British companies that have supply chains running through the province, and particularly those in the apparel industry? And considering that the European Union will soon introduce legislation next year on due diligence, does the Minister believe that such guidance should be legally enforceable? Second, on changes to the operation of the Modern Slavery Act, I appreciate that the Foreign Secretary acknowledged that the Act is not working and the proposed changes are welcome. Can the noble Lord indicate when we can expect the necessary legislation to be laid before Parliament, and will the affirmative procedure be used to allow both houses to consider it in full? I hope that the government will consider strengthening the Modern Slavery Act with more substantive changes. For example, Section 54 only applies to large companies with a turnover above 36 million. Does the government intend to broaden the scope of the provisions? Third, on the guidance, is the noble Lord able to confirm that he is confident that this guidance alone is sufficient at this stage, or whether the government intends to introduce necessary legislation to hold those to account who act against such guidance? And finally, the review of export controls. I warmly welcome this step, and the noble Lord will be aware of the amendment to the trade bill in my name and that of Lord Purvis and the Lord Alton and the Right Reverend the Lord Bishop of St Albans. That amendment, of course, is being considered by the Commons as I speak. And my Lords, whatever the outcome of the Commons' consideration of those amendments, I hope that the noble Lord will be able to explain tonight how the government will ensure that future trade agreements will not contribute to such human rights abuses like those in Xinjiang. The best way is to give Parliament proper opportunity to scrutinise, which it has not had over the rollover agreements we've seen since Brexit. My Lords, whatever action we should take must involve like-minded international partners. It's over a year now since the government called on the United Nations observers to be given immediate and unfettered access to Xinjiang to verify claims, and the government of China continues to refuse. Can the noble Lord set out what steps the United Kingdom will take at the UN to hold the government of China to account, including at the Human Rights Council? What steps is being taken to support the appointment of a UN Special Rapporteur for the investigation of forced labour and ethnic persecution in Xinjiang? And my lords, in addition to the UN, in June of this year, of course, the UK is set to host the G7. Can the Noble Lord tell the House if there are any plans to place this horrendous human rights abuse of Xinjiang onto that agenda? My lords, the human rights violations in Xinjiang have shocked the world, and in recent months, and it is now time for the world to act and respond.
Baroness Northover.
My lords, I too would like to thank the Noble Lord for bringing us this statement. The Foreign Secretary describes an appalling situation and something with which we have become familiar. It's vital that our businesses do not benefit from slave labour in Xinjiang or anywhere else. And the possibility of genocide must always be at the forefront of our minds, not least as we come up to Holocaust Memorial Day. The Commons is indeed currently considering the amendments we sent them to the trade bill. Ministers have been saying that Parliament, not the courts, should decide on genocide in relation to trade agreements. The Noble Lord usually says that international courts should decide on genocide, but he also admits that this is impossible when it comes to China. Yesterday, in relation to Nagorno-Karabakh, he said, and I quote, it is a long-standing government policy that genocide is a matter for judicial decision rather than for governments or non-judicial bodies. That actually seems in line with the amendment in the Commons. Judicial decision. He did not say international judicial decision, not Parliament. Could he comment? The Chinese Communist Party has described the forced sterilization of Uyghur women as, and I quote, emancipation. The UN Convention on Genocide clearly forbids this. The Noble Lord will also know that under the Convention, when a state learns or should have learned of the serious risk of genocide, they must take action. Is his department making an assessment in relation to the Uyghurs, and will he publish its conclusions? And given that China blocks routes through to international courts, does he agree that the United Kingdom has a responsibility to find alternative routes to make the legal determination? The second area I want to ask about are indeed the Magnitsky sanctions, as the Noble Lord, Lord Collins did. The government is always saying they keep these under review. He will no doubt say that today. Yet the United States does apply such sanctions in relation to China. Why are we not? The Foreign Secretary noted last week, and I quote him, "Of course, many countries are nervous in their dealings with China because of its asymmetric economic clout." Indeed so. The Noble Lord rightly says that sanctions are most effective when undertaken jointly with others. There are three major economic blocs in the world: the United States, China, and the EU. We now have to work that much harder to gain traction amongst European allies, not just France and Germany. So what progress is the government making here? The last area I want to ask the Noble Lord about is in relation to company law. I worked on the Companies Act of 2006. We included supply chains. Can the Noble Lord explain why neither the Companies Act nor the Modern-Day Slavery Act have proved sufficient here? Clearly, reputation is vitally important. I noted how quickly companies acted after the Rana Plaza disaster when they realized their reputations were at stake. And what about public procurement? Can we be sure that the PPE which we so anxiously sought during the pandemic did not come from Xinjiang? There were reports of some of it originating in North Korea. Who will monitor and act on the new measures he proposes? Which minister, in which department, and will legislation be brought forward as indicated, and if so, when, to close the loopholes which the government clearly identifies exist in the Companies Act and in the Modern Day Slavery Act? The European Union, as the Noble Lord Collins noted, intends to introduce legislation on due diligence, which will be mandatory. Are we working with them so that our standards are at least equivalent? And will this issue be considered at the G7 or D10, or however it is defined in June? I look forward to hearing the Noble Lord's response, and I look forward also to the questions and answers from Noble Lords who have so much experience in this area.
My Lords, may I firstly thank the Noble Lord Collins and the Noble Lady Baroness Northover for their welcome of the provisions that have been announced. And let me also reassure them that, as they would have seen, indeed, earlier today I was engaging with one of the key NGOs that I speak to on a regular basis on issues of human rights with a specific focus on Xinjiang. And I think it's worth just taking a step back, and I pay tribute to many in your Lordship's house and in the other place, as well as other advocates around the world, to see where we have got to on this important issue over even the last 3 years period. There was a time where the issue of Xinjiang and the situation of the Uyghurs was not often debated. But what we have seen is, because of the advocacy from across your Lordship's house and in the other place, a real strength and a real momentum behind the actions we've seen in terms of both international action, the United Kingdom working with key partners, but also the debates and the rich debates we've had on various bills, as well as more generally, as we're doing today, on specific matters relating to the situation in Xinjiang. And I pay tribute to all Noble Lords in your Lordship's house and in members in the other place for their continued, not just interest, but strong advocacy, for that is what's required. Picking up on some of the specific questions, if I may, first of all, on the issues raised by the Noble Lord Collins on issues of guidance and working with businesses. And I think from my own experience of the private sector over 20 years, I think the approach has always been of successive governments, from the nature of the environment we work in, to work with business and to offer guidance and structure so businesses can act. And this new robust and detailed guidance to UK business does set out quite specific risks faced by companies with links to Xinjiang, and underlying the challenges of effective due diligence, a point made by the Noble Lady Baroness Northover as well. And there will be a minister-led campaign of business engagement, which was a point Noble Lord Collins again raised, specifically led by my right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, with a organised forum called the Business Against Slavery Forum, made up of businesses, which I also understand my right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, will also attend. The Noble Lord Collins also raised the issue of sanctions and further designations, as did the Noble Lady Baroness Northover. And I have to be consistent with what I've said before. Yes, of course, we keep the situation under review across the world, because it is important that with the new regime that was introduced by this government, that we continue to monitor abuses of human rights. And I can assure Noble Lords of this, that we will continue to act. And again, answering a point the Noble Lady raised about acting in partnership with key partners, of course we've noted very carefully the action taken by the United States. And on the issue of the European Union, again, we work very closely with the European Union during the transition period, and as we have now come to the end of that in terms of the new engagement and relationship we will build, as my right honourable friend the Prime Minister has said, we want to be the closest ally and friend to the European Union, and we will work together on our shared values agenda. And as I've said, and I stand by this, that it is important that when it comes to sanctions policy, there's not the necessity sometimes of the institutional frameworks, as we've seen and demonstrated with our relationships with the likes of Australia, Canada and the US, but the importance of the relationships being strengthened further. And we will continue to work with all our allies, including the European Union, as we bring forward sanctions in the human rights area across the world, to ensure that those who abuse human rights are held to account and suffer as a consequence of their abuse of human rights. The Noble Lord Collins, talked of new legislation and also confirmations of affirmative procedures on some of the changes that have been proposed on the Modern Slavery Act. My right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, will shortly, and this will be discussed through usual channels, be bringing forward the details of the changes which will be taken forward. And this will include further sort of intent on including on financial penalties for businesses that do not comply with their transparency obligations in this respect. One thing I would say, and the Noble Lady Baroness Northover raised this particular issue, as did the Noble Lord Collins. I go back to 2015 when my right honourable friend, the member for Maidenhead, then as Home Secretary Theresa May, and I remember working directly with my right honourable friend, and it was what was happening in the UK which really spurred on this groundbreaking act, which was well supported across all parts of your Lordship's House. And that, I think, set the premise and the basis on the actions that we can now take today. Indeed, other countries, such as Australia, have followed the lead of the United Kingdom. Yes, more work needs to be done, more actions need to be brought, and the steps we're taking in this respect relating to Xinjiang underline our commitment that we believe in further strengthening the Modern Slavery Act. So it is for the purpose that it was set up to ensure that we can stop particularly the issues of supply chains where people's human rights are abused, and make full use of the Act's provisions and strengthen them where necessary. Let me also assure the Noble Lady Baroness Northover on the issue of public procurement. The government will provide guidance and now extending provisions to support for all UK public bodies to use public procurement rules to exclude suppliers where there is sufficient evidence of human rights violations in supply chains. Compliance with will be mandatory for central government, non-departmental bodies and executive agencies. We expect this will increase public sector bodies' ability and willingness to exclude specific suppliers. And we also expect increased scrutiny to drive up the standards and due diligence. Again, a point the Noble Lady raised with companies supplying government. Both the Noble Lord and the Noble Lady raised the issue of international cooperation and continued advocacy. The Noble Lord Collins, rightly again raised action within the context of the UN institutions, particularly the UN Human Rights Council. Let me assure the Noble Lord, and I look forward to engaging with him and the Noble Lady as well as others on this as we look forward to the next Human Rights Council. The United Kingdom returns as a member, but it's also notable to see China returning to the Human Rights Council. But I assure you we will focus in on our agenda, and as we did at the previous Human Rights Council, it's only the second time that our Item 4 statement was specifically just on the issue in Xinjiang or indeed Hong Kong, and we will continue to retain focus and build momentum. And we have seen success, as all Noble Lords know, from the UN Third Committee statement, which saw 39 members, built from the 28 in June, supporting our statement both on the situation in Xinjiang and in Hong Kong. On the issue of the G7 agenda, which was raised by both the Noble Lord Collins and the Noble Lady Baroness Northover, obviously we are working through the importance of the agenda. The Prime Minister recently announced that he himself will be hosting the G7 leaders in Cornwall, and of course the Foreign Secretary will be convening a meeting of G7 foreign ministers. And as my right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, has said, the importance of the values agenda, the importance of defending human rights will very much be factored into our thinking. As we are able to share some of the specifics of that agenda, of course, I will do so.
My Lords, we now come to the 20 minutes allocated for backbench questions. Questions and answers should be brief, so the maximum number of speakers can be called. Lord Forsyth of Drumlene.
My Lords, my noble friend said a few moments ago that he had to be consistent in what he'd said before. Can I just raise with him the issue which is being discussed now in the other place, of the determination of the crime of genocide, which he has always said is a matter for the courts. And yet ministers in the government are now arguing that it would be quite wrong for the High Court in this country, which my noble friend Lord Hope has made clear is perfectly competent to do this. So how can it be right to say that it's for a matter for a court, which my noble friend has already indicated would be subject to a veto, and not right for the High Court here to determine behavior such as we're seeing in Xinjiang as being genocide?
My Lord, my noble friend is indeed correct. We've consistently said about the importance of competent legal authorities, the courts, ruling on these particular issues. When it comes to international matters, of course, the institutions which do exist, as the noble lady Baroness Northover said, have been frustrated because of the lack of cooperation. I think the challenge we have with the amendment, which is being discussed in the other place, and it's a live debate, so I'm mindful of what I may be saying to assure consistency, not just across two houses, but two departments and two different ministers speaking at the same time. But certainly it comes to the issue of separation of powers, and I think our concern comes from the High Court having the power to frustrate trade agreements and the operation of government's foreign policy. And let me assure my noble friend, it's not about whether genocide has occurred or not in Xinjiang. It is about the crucial issue of the separation of powers, which is the key concern of the government.
Lord Field of Birkenhead.
For his statement, and might he tell the House a little more about the instructions that the government's given to those who purchase on its behalf a considerable range of goods, including goods made in China, including cotton goods made in China, made under slave labour conditions. If he could give the House more details about how he thinks the government budget is going to be used in this respect, we'd all be grateful to him.
My Lords, noble Lord is again right to raise this issue. One of the particular or specific announcements we made was, whilst there were obligations within the context of existing legislation for the private sector, there was a notable omission for the guidance which was issued to UK public bodies, and we have used the proposal to further detail what we expect, and those guidance with all the agencies I've already listed will be shared with all departmental bodies and executive agencies, and it will increase public sector bodies' ability and willingness to exclude specific suppliers. And I think that sharing of evidence of where those specific suppliers are will also be helpful, particularly when you're talking of various government departmental bodies. We also believe that will increase scrutiny to drive up standards and the due diligence that public sector bodies themselves apply when supplying to government. In terms of the full details of that, as those are laid, I'll of course be happy to share with the noble Lord and lay a copy of that in the library.
Unfortunately, Baroness Kennedy could not be reached. I call Baroness Smith of Newnham.
My Lords, the noble Lord the Minister has pointed out in his previous response that the advice given to public sector wasn't the same as to the private sector. Can he reassure the House that public sector procurement hasn't included PPE or other imports from slave labour? Because I think that is something that the House and the rest of the United Kingdom really needs to understand and be reassured about.
My Lords, I think what I can't do to the noble lady, and I'm sure she would expect me to sort of give the 100% that every single public sector body with every single contract for me to affirm that has complied fully with the issues that she's raised. What I can assure the noble lady and all noble lords, as I've done just now to the noble Lord Field, is to the new government guidance, and we will work with public bodies to ensure that the rules are fully understood and there is a sufficient focus and sufficient evidence of human rights violations which occur in supply chains that public bodies are fully cognizant of, so they can act appropriately. And I hope with that reassurance that as we move forward we will certainly be strengthening our work within the public procurement sector.
Lord Garnier.
My Lord, the government's statement, for which I thank my noble friend the Minister, is clear and well motivated, but if I may say so, it's only so far so good. will my noble friend agree that China will do absolutely nothing until we name the senior Chinese government officials responsible for this inhumane activity, ban them and their families from traveling abroad, freeze their bank accounts, and impose the widest possible Magnitsky sanctions upon them?
I think my noble friend may know the answer I'm about to give before I give it, but he makes very powerful points about the importance of the end result of the human rights sanctions regime that we apply, that it does send a very strong signal to those who abuse human rights that there is going to be consequences of their actions. Let me also assure my noble friend that what I alluded to earlier, there has been a real move in terms of where we are in terms of international action on this important issue. And as we look forward to strengthening our work with partners, I'm sure if through China not cooperating, what we are pressing for is access to Xinjiang through the Human Rights Commissioner visiting as the next key stage, and we will continue to work with our partners to ensure there's greater transparency on the Chinese side. But I would say to my noble friend, the Chinese do take note, not just of debates here and in the other place, but of the action which is being taken internationally, and they are concerned about the situation which is currently being raised internationally in terms of their own positioning on the global stage.
Alton of Liverpool.
My Lords, last week in the House of Commons, the Foreign Secretary told the House that what is happening in Xinjiang is on an industrial scale. Perhaps the most shocking example of which has been the reported export of 81 tons of human hair shaved off the heads of Uyghur slave labour. Dominic Raab's predecessor, Jeremy Hunt, has said, and I quote, "No responsible country would engage in free trade agreements with a state committing genocide." Could the noble Lord the Minister give a firm commitment now on the floor of the House that the United Kingdom will not negotiate a free trade agreement with China until the United Nations is permitted to investigate Xinjiang and these violations on an industrial scale? And secondly, will he undertake to ask the Foreign Secretary to urgently respond to the request of the movers of Amendments 3, both here and in the House of Commons, to meet with Mr. Raab to discuss the next steps in dealing specifically with the crime of genocide?
My Lords, on the noble Lord's second point, I'm sure my right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary and his team, I know will be looking at all requests as we receive from colleagues from across both houses, and I will certainly follow up on what the noble Lord has raised. On his earlier point, I think the important thing, and as I speak as the Human Rights Minister, is that with any trade agreement that we look to negotiate, any trade agreement that we're involved with, the issues of human rights will be reflected in the discussions that we will have. As I've said before, China is an important strategic partner to the United Kingdom and has an important role to play in the world. But in doing so, it needs to also recognise that the situation in Xinjiang is not just going unnoticed, it's that they're now being pressed and being held account for what's going on.
Baroness Blackstone.
I welcome the fact that the statement recognises the appalling nature of the human rights abuses by Chinese authorities against the Uighur people, some of which have just been described by the noble Lord Alton. But given the denial of access to the region and the refusal to admit that these abuses are taking place by the Chinese authorities, I do really wonder why we are being so slow in applying Magnitsky sanctions to the violators. I want to support what the noble Lord Garnier has already said. The Minister has said we're keeping this under review, but can I say to him, I hope he won't mind me doing this, that this seems rather feeble in the circumstances that we're now in. The time surely is for action, not just keeping something under review.
My Lords, I hear what the noble lady has said. The new sanctions regime was only launched last summer, and I'm sure she would agree with me that many of the, if not all the designations that have been made have been done both with validity but also the strength of the abuses that have occurred. We are in no way, and I say this very clearly, the situation in Xinjiang and the action we have taken is demonstrable of our not just concern, but as the Foreign Secretary has said in the other place as well, the dire situation faced by the Uighur Muslims, and let's also not forget other minorities within Xinjiang as well. And we have taken action beyond, and of course, I take note of the issue around sanctions, but the actions we've taken, whether in Hong Kong, engaging and showing international support, the issues and limitations on extradition treaties with Hong Kong, arms exports, and the recent provisions we've announced on forced labour show that the government isn't sitting back. We are taking action, and there is a wide range of steps we can take. But of course, as ever, I note very carefully what the noble lady has put forward.
Lord Campbell of Pitt and Weem.
My Lords, I welcome and support these proposals, but bearing in mind the response of the Chinese government when the Australian government supported an independent inquiry into the outbreak of the virus in Wuhan, is the government ready to hold the line and not to back down if there's a similar response in this case?
My Lords, I can assure the noble Lord that the government of China has not been in any way pleased with the leadership the United Kingdom has shown on this important issue, both bilaterally in raising the issues directly with the Chinese Authority, but also important in building international alliances, and we will continue to do so. We have an important relationship with China, but that does not hold us back for calling out the challenges and abuses of human rights as we see them and when we see them.
Lord Sheikh.
My Lords, I feel that what is happening in China is reminiscent of the Holocaust, which has also been said by the Board of Deputies. The unfortunate victims this time are Muslims. My Lords, we must now all decide to put a stop to what's going on. Whilst I support the measures set out in the statement, we need to take more robust actions and proceed to declare the persecution as genocide, invoke Magnitsky sanction, and consider legislation similar to the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act in the United States. Furthermore, if the amendment on the trade bill is not accepted in other place, we need to think about introducing similar measures in the future. And also, I'd like to add that if China does not allow outsiders, including the UN Commissioner, to have access to Xinjiang, then we must stop Chinese officials from coming to the United Kingdom.
My Lords, a series of questions there. Some, I believe, I've already answered, and I'm sure my noble friend would acknowledge that. But of course, I share with him, that, as does the government, the importance of acting and acting now. And as I've already illustrated, over the last few years, we've seen real action being taken through multilateral fora, as well as directly as the statement from the Foreign Secretary has demonstrated. And of course, this doesn't stop here. If China fails to cooperate, of course, we will continue to look to see what further provisions and actions can be taken. And of course, we take note of what our international partners are doing as well. And on issues of sanctions, as I've said consistently before as well, the application of sanctions work most effectively when we do so in partnership. On the point of stopping access to the UK for officials, one thing I will share with my noble friend, particularly through my engagement on multilateral fora, even with your worst foe, you should never stop talking, because by talking, you are able to deliver your point of argument. So I do believe, and China remains an important partner, that we will continue to work constructively where we agree with China and raise issues of human rights concerns where we do not.
Baroness Faulkner of Margravine.
My Lord, I too welcome the statement, but I'm conscious that the statement talks about cooperation with international partners, and the noble Lord the Minister will recognise that sanctions of whatever form work best when there is across-the-board cooperation among countries. So could he, noting that the EU has just completed an investment accord with China, could he tell the House what actions we're going to take if EU firms manage to export to the UK items which are made with forced labour, while UK firms are disadvantaged? What conversations are they having with France and Germany to ensure that doesn't happen?
My Lords, I agree with the noble lady. Working together, as I've already said, is the most effective way of doing so. And I assure the noble lady we're working very closely with our European allies and friends on the important issue of global human rights sanctions. Indeed, it was our sanctions regime which they then followed. And we'll continue to work closely with them in this respect. In terms of practical terms on the question she's raised, I'm sure that's a matter for the EU, and the EU will act quickly and swiftly in that respect.
Baroness Gowdy.
My Lords, I accept the Minister's statement. Last week, I asked the Minister for Trade about human rights being involved in all our actions on trade debates and signing contracts. The Minister was not able to answer me whether this would be the first item when we discuss trade with China and other countries. Could we get an undertaking that we will not go into further negotiations with China or anyone else without having human rights as one of the first agendas on the agenda?
My Lords, let me assure the noble lady the issue of human rights when it comes to trade agreements on a bilateral basis is a key consideration in our discussions.
Lord Balfe.
My Lords, I've said in this chamber before that we have to look at the broad picture of China. The Belt and Road Initiative is about a very different China in the world, and we need to pull ourselves together to have a common position between both the United States, Europe and ourselves. In particular, how are we going to get the people on the ground to actually see what is going on? Because the Chinese are not allowing people in. And unless they get in, we're not going to find out. I mean, we couldn't even find out what was going on in Leicester, and that's in our own country. We've got to find a way of putting people on the ground in the province.
My Lords, I agree with my noble friend. China is part of the international community, and we continue to state that particular point that my noble friend has articulated very strongly through all our multilateral forum engagement.
Lord Singh of Wimbledon. No response. Baroness Stewart of Edgbaston.
My Lords, when it comes to Xinjiang, no one can say we didn't know. And I welcome this statement, and particularly the transparency requirements on companies. But as a liberal democracy, it is also important that we show it's not just the government which object to this, but so do the people of the British Isles. Will the Minister therefore make it obvious when companies aren't complying with the transparency requirements and encourage retailers such as Marks and Spencer's, who have made it clear that they will stop trading in cotton and garments which have been the result of slave labor, so that we as consumers can be absolutely clear that we do not purchase any of these products?
My Lords, the noble lady makes a very powerful point, and I think communication and strengthening communication in that respect is something we will look at very carefully.
Lord Hunt of King's Heath.
My Lords, I welcome the statement. My particular concern has been the horrific practice in Xinjiang and other parts of China of enforced organ harvesting from prisoners of conscience. The China Tribunal concluded that in regard to the Uyghurs, the tribunal had evidence of medical testing on a scale that could allow them to become an organ bank. My Lords, will the government take action to prevent British companies exporting equipment to China which could be used for this horrific practice, and holding them to account for their business and human rights obligations?
My Lords, let me assure the noble Lord, as I've engaged with him previously on this issue, we take this very seriously, and again he makes some very pertinent points that I shall reflect upon, but this is very much high up my agenda and seeing how we can move to a practical application. Indeed, I'm seeing Sir Geoffrey Nice later this week as well to discuss further.
Lord Austin of Dudley.
My Lords, this is a brutal and corrupt dictatorship, and the idea, advanced by some, that the closer the relationship with the West, the quicker they will move to freedom and democracy, has been proved completely wrong, because whilst trade has increased massively over the last 30 years, China today is more illiberal and guilty of worse atrocities. 1 million Muslims in concentration camps, slave labour, people being killed, forced sterilizations, children removed from their parents, anyone who opposes the regime locked up. So the Minister and the government should listen to the noble lords who have spoken this afternoon, and we should impose Magnitsky sanctions on the dictatorship's leadership and those who use this regime's brutality to enrich themselves.
My lords, let me assure the noble lord, and indeed all within your lordship's house, that we are not just listening very carefully in the number of areas, we are also acting quite decisively, and we will continue to do so. If I may, I've had this portfolio as Human Rights Minister for 3 years. About 3 years ago, and the noble Lord Collins, noble Lord Alton may have insights in this respect, amongst others, that the debates we saw were few and infrequent within your lordship's house. What we see today is, yes, we may have different perspectives on the speed and pace at which the government may be moving, but I listen very carefully, as does my right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, as do other ministers, on the wise counsel of your lordship's house, and I can assure you we will continue to engage both within the chamber and outside the chamber on the important issue of human rights, not just in China, but across the world.